The Atlantic Ocean, on the night of the 23rd of June 1944, was a universe of ink-black emptiness. 800 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands, a behemoth of steel slipped through the silent depths. This was the Japanese submarine I-52, a vessel that represented the pinnacle of Imperial Japan's engineering prowess. Inside its cramped, humid corridors, under the dim glow of instrument panels, Commander Uno Kameo may have allowed himself a rare moment of professional satisfaction. His mission, one of the most critical of the war for Japan, was nearing a successful rendezvous. The most dangerous part, he might have thought, was already behind them. The I-52 was no ordinary warship. It was a ghost, a courier on a mission of immense strategic importance. Deep within its hull, secured against the crushing pressure of the deep, was a cargo that could have altered the technological balance of the war. Reports suggest it carried 2 metric tons of gold bars, a king's ransom intended as payment for advanced German military technology. Alongside the gold were 146 bars of raw opium for medical use, and perhaps most importantly, a collection of Japan's most brilliant engineering minds and their blueprints. They were on a Yanagi mission, a clandestine exchange designed to ferry vital resources and knowledge between the two Axis powers, now isolated on opposite ends of the world. Just hours earlier, the I-52 had successfully met its German counterpart, the U-530, exchanging personnel and equipping a new, advanced German radar detector. For all intents and purposes, the mission seemed blessed by fortune. To Commander Kameo and his 94 crewmen, the ocean was their greatest ally. It was a vast, three-dimensional wilderness where they were the masters of stealth, the apex predators. They had been trained in the unforgiving naval academies of Japan, steeped in a warrior culture that valued skill, discipline, and a willingness to die for the emperor. Their submarine was a magnificent machine, larger than many American destroyers, capable of circumnavigating the globe. They believed that by diving deep into the cold, silent blackness, they became invisible, untouchable. They had every reason to feel confident. They were the silent service, the sharpest point of the imperial spear, and they were carrying the hopes of an empire within their steel hull. But their confidence was built on a fatally outdated understanding of the battlefield. While they saw the ocean as a sanctuary, a place to hide, the Americans had transformed it into something else entirely. Unbeknownst to the most seasoned commanders in the Japanese fleet, the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic had become a technological hunting ground, a digital surveillance grid where sound, not sight, determined life and death. The hunters were no longer just ships on the horizon or planes in the sky. The very water itself was being weaponized against them. The belief that diving deep meant escaping was an illusion. In this new war, diving deep only meant you were hiding from human eyes, while becoming perfectly visible to the relentless, unblinking ears of a new and terrifying technology. Every hum of their machinery, every pulse of their propellers, was a death sentence waiting to be heard. The story of the I-52 is not merely the tale of a single submarine's final voyage. It is the story of a catastrophic collision between two warring philosophies. On one side, the Japanese dedication to perfecting individual weapons, crafting them with the precision and spirit of a samurai's sword. On the other, the American industrial behemoth, the arsenal of democracy, which focused not just on building weapons, but on creating integrated systems of warfare networks of detection, communication, and destruction that operated on a scale the world had never seen. The courage and skill of the men aboard the I-52 were beyond question. But they were about to discover that in this brutal, modern conflict, courage was not enough. Everything about their mission had gone perfectly. The rendezvous was flawless. Their new German equipment was working. The path to occupied France lay open before them. Yet, in the cold, unforgiving mathematics of this new technological war, their perfection was merely a prelude to extinction. Within the next 3 hours, Commander Kameo, his 94 sailors and engineers, their 2 tons of gold, and the secrets they carried would be violently erased from the surface of the earth, sent to their final resting place 2 miles beneath the waves. They would die without ever seeing their enemy, victims of a ghost they couldn't comprehend. How could one of Japan's most advanced submarines, a phantom of the deep, be tracked so precisely and eliminated so clinically in the crushing vastness of the Atlantic? The answer was not found in a faster plane or a bigger bomb. It lay in a revolutionary piece of technology, so secret and so effective that the crew of the I-52 likely never even knew what was killing them. They were being hunted not by men, but by sound itself. To truly comprehend the fate of the I-52, we must pull back from that single, desperate night in the Atlantic and look at the vast, invisible battlefield where this war was truly being decided. This wasn't a war fought just by soldiers and sailors, but by factory workers, engineers, and entire national economies. It was a silent, brutal war of production numbers, supply chains, and technological innovation. And in this war, Japan was facing a mathematical certainty of defeat long before its submarines ever left port. The story of the I-52 is the story of a beautifully crafted sword brought to a fight against an industrial sledgehammer. Japan's wartime philosophy was rooted in a pursuit of perfection, a belief in the superweapon. This gave birth to marvels of engineering, like the Yamato-class battleships, the largest in history, and the I-400 class submarines, behemoths so large they were, literally underwater aircraft carriers, each capable of launching 3 bomber aircraft. These were magnificent achievements, the products of brilliant minds and dedicated craftsmanship. They were designed to be decisive, to deliver a single, perfect strike that could cripple the enemy's will to fight. But they were also incredibly expensive, time-consuming to build, and nearly impossible to replace. Japan built its weapons like an artisan, pouring its soul into a few flawless masterpieces. The United States, however, approached the war like an industrialist. It embraced the concept of the arsenal of democracy, a term that barely does justice to the sheer scale of its productive power. While Japan painstakingly built a total of 70 frontline submarines during the war, the United States churned out an astonishing 314. The math was simple and terrifying. For every submarine the American fleet lost, another 3 or 4 were sliding down the slipways in places like Groton, Connecticut, or Manitowoc, Wisconsin. American industry could absorb losses that would have been catastrophic for the Japanese. The conflict became a war of attrition that Japan simply could not win. An American submarine commander could take risks, knowing his boat was, in a strategic sense, expendable. His Japanese counterpart knew his vessel was a precious, irreplaceable national asset. This industrial disparity created a profound social and psychological chasm between the two nations. In Japan, the human cost of this imbalance was felt with an intimate, heartbreaking certainty. By 1944, the submarine service had become a virtual death sentence. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force would eventually suffer a casualty rate exceeding 70%, one of the highest of any branch in the entire war. When a young man was accepted into submarine school, his family would often mourn him as if he were already gone. It was a quiet, heartbreaking ritual, an acknowledgement of the grim reality that the Empire was sending its sons on one-way missions, their courage and skill pitted against an overwhelming tide of steel. Their sacrifice was a testament to their loyalty, but it was a sacrifice born of industrial desperation. Contrast this with the American home front. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, the woman in the factory, symbolized a nation united not in grim sacrifice, but in confident, powerful production. Millions of American men and women went to work every day not with a sense of impending doom, but with a fierce determination to build the tools that would bring their husbands, sons, and brothers home safely. The radio waves that Lieutenant Commander Nambu would later listen to in shock were filled with this casual confidence. Advertisements for consumer goods, reports of record-breaking factory outputs, the vibrant hum of a nation fighting a war overseas without sacrificing its way of life at home. The American war machine wasn't just building ships and planes. It was fueled by an unshakable belief that overwhelming production was the surest path to victory and the safest way to protect its people. This was the true asymmetry. Could the fierce loyalty and samurai spirit of a Japanese sailor possibly compete with an enemy that could replace its losses faster than they could be inflicted? The answer was being proven every day in the deep, dark waters of the Pacific and Atlantic. Japanese commanders, steeped in the tradition of decisive naval battles, were beginning to sense a terrifying shift in the nature of warfare. They were being stalked and killed by an enemy who seemed to operate with a different set of rules, one who didn't need to meet them in a fair fight. They just needed to find them, and that is where the game truly changed. The Americans understood that the biggest submarine in the world was useless if it could be detected. They didn't need to build a bigger submarine. They needed to build a better ear. While Japanese engineers focused on making their submarines giants, American scientists were quietly perfecting a device that could listen to their heartbeats from miles away. They were about to turn every patrol aircraft, no matter how simple, into a sophisticated submarine hunter, giving pilots a sense they had never possessed before: the ability to hear through water. The ocean was about to lose its silence forever. The technological leap that sealed the fate of the I-52 wasn't a single earth-shattering invention, but the clever combination of several existing technologies into a system of terrifying efficiency. The linchpin of this system was a device so deceptively simple, it looked almost disposable: the sonar buoy. To the untrained eye, it was just a 5-foot-long metal tube, but when dropped from an aircraft, it became a revolutionary weapon that fundamentally altered the dynamics of submarine warfare. It was, in essence, a disposable underwater listening post, an ear that could be placed anywhere in the vastness of the ocean. Here's how this elegant, deadly system worked. When a patrol plane like the one flown by Lieutenant Commander Jesse D. Taylor detected a submarine on its surface radar, the submarine would invariably do what it was designed to do: crash dive, seeking safety in the depths. In the past, this was often the end of the engagement. A plane could see a submarine on the surface, but once it was submerged, it vanished. The pilot could only guess its location, drop a few depth charges based on a hunch, and hope for the best. The sonar buoy changed everything. Once the I-52 submerged, Taylor's crew would begin dropping these tubes from their Avenger torpedo bomber. As a sonar buoy hit the water, a parachute would detach, and the device would deploy. A small float containing a radio transmitter would remain on the surface, while a hydrophone, a sensitive underwater microphone, would descend to a predetermined depth, dangling beneath it. Suddenly, the American pilots were no longer blind. They could hear the sound of the I-52's propellers, the hum of its electric motors. Every noise the submarine made was now being picked up by these hydrophones and transmitted back to a receiver in Taylor's aircraft. The pilots, flying in circles miles above the unseen vessel, could listen to its every move as if they had their ear pressed against its hull. The man at the center of this new form of warfare, Jesse D. Taylor, was a perfect representative of the American approach. He was not a swashbuckling fighter ace or a hardened naval veteran from a long line of seafarers. He was a Naval Reserve pilot, a civilian in uniform, likely a businessman or a professional who had answered the call to duty. His mindset was not that of a warrior seeking a glorious duel, but of a pragmatic problem solver. Hunting a submarine was a methodical, technical challenge. It was a job to be done with the best tools available. And in the summer of 1944, he had been given the very best tool imaginable. His crew was trained not in the ancient art of naval combat, but in the brand new science of acoustic detection. They were technicians of a new kind of war. This technology was still in its infancy. The sonar buoy system, codenamed WWII, had only become operational in early 1944. The hunt for the I-52 was one of its first major, real-world tests in the unforgiving environment of the deep Atlantic. There was no guarantee of success. The buoys could malfunction. The ocean's ambient noise could drown out the submarine's signature. The submarine commander could perform a clever, evasive maneuver that would take him outside the detection range. This added a tense layer of uncertainty to the hunt. For Taylor and his crew, it wasn't just a mission against the Japanese. It was a test of their faith in this new, almost magical technology. They were pioneers on a new frontier of warfare, writing the rulebook as they went. To turn a vague sound into a precise location, the Americans developed a simple but brilliant tactic. They would drop a pattern of multiple sonar buoys, creating a net of listening posts. Each buoy transmitted on a different radio frequency, and the aircraft's receiver could switch between them. By listening to which buoy was picking up the loudest signal, the operator could determine the submarine's general position and direction of travel. To make it even easier for the pilots circling above, the buoys were color-coded, deploying a dye marker into the water: purple, orange, blue, red, yellow. From the air, the pattern of buoys looked like a strange, colorful constellation on the dark surface of the ocean. But for the submarine below, this constellation was a cage. Commander Kameo, believing he had reached the safety of the depths, was now navigating his vessel directly through an invisible, acoustic minefield. He was surrounded by silent, patient listeners that were betraying his every move. The very element he trusted for protection had become a medium for his destruction. The deep ocean, once a symbol of sanctuary and stealth, was now a soundstage, where the I-52 was the unwilling star, and its final performance was being broadcast to a deadly audience above. The trap was set. The hunters were listening, and the I-52, deaf and blind to the danger encircling it, was sailing straight into the center of the grid. High above the black ocean, inside the cramped cockpit of his TBF Avenger, Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor stared at the glowing green sweep of his radar screen. And then he saw it, a tiny, fleeting blip of light. In the immense emptiness of the Atlantic, a radar contact like this was a near impossibility, a ghost on the machine. But it was there, and it was real. For the crew of the I-52, it was the beginning of the end, though they would not know it. On the surface, traveling to recharge its batteries under the cover of darkness, the submarine was momentarily exposed. Its steel hull, perfect target for the invisible radio waves scanning the night. Inside the I-52's control room, the sudden scream of the new German radar detector must have shattered the routine calm. An alarm bell clanged. "Dive! Dive! Dive!" Commander Kameo's voice would have been sharp, urgent, cutting through the sudden chaos. The klaxon would have blared as sailors scrambled to their stations. The giant submarine, with a lurch, would have angled its bow downwards, the sea closing over its deck in a rush of white foam. Within a minute, it was gone from the surface, swallowed by the depths. Kameo, relying on decades of naval doctrine, had done exactly the right thing. He had taken his vessel into its natural element, the one place a plane could not follow. He believed he was safe. In Taylor's aircraft, the radar blip vanished just as suddenly as it had appeared. The hunt was on. This was the critical moment where the old rules of war ended and the new ones began. Taylor banked his Avenger, circling the submarine's last known position like a hawk. His crew prepared the tools of this new trade. The bomb bay doors opened, and the first sonobuoy dropped away, a thin metal tube tumbling into the darkness, its small parachute blossoming to guide it to the water's surface. Then another, and another. Soon, a carefully laid pattern of colored dye markers, purple, orange, blue, stained the ocean surface, creating a listening grid invisible to the men below. Inside the cockpit, a crewman donned his headset, his face lit by the faint glow of the radio receiver. He switched through the channels, listening intently to the sounds of the deep ocean. At first, there was nothing but the hiss of static and the ambient groan of the sea. Then, through one of the channels, came a new sound. It was faint, but unmistakable, a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of the I-52's massive propellers churning through the water, the sound of 95 men moving towards their doom, utterly oblivious that they were broadcasting their every move. The ghost had a voice. The contrast between the two vessels in that moment is staggering. Aboard the I-52, there was likely a tense, disciplined silence. The crew, running on quiet electric motors, would be listening, straining to hear the sound of an enemy ship, their senses the only defense they had. Above them, in the Avenger, there was no such tension. There was only the calm, methodical process of triangulation. Getting a strong signal on blue, the operator would report. Fainter on orange, he's heading southeast. They were tracking a target on a screen, plotting vectors, and calculating intercepts. This is where the very nature of combat had changed. The courage of Commander Cameo and his crew was rendered irrelevant. Their skill in submarine operations, their willingness to fight to the death, none of it mattered. This was not a battle between two warriors. It was a technical problem being solved by a team of specialists. It was an execution, carried out from a distance with clinical precision. The honor of a fair fight, a concept central to the warrior code of the Japanese, had been erased by the cold logic of technology. Once they had a firm track on the I-52's course and speed, Taylor prepared to deploy the weapon that made this new form of warfare so lethally effective. It was the Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo, a weapon so revolutionary that it behaved more like a predator than a projectile. The crew had a nickname for it, Fido, because like a loyal dog, you could tell it to go fetch, and it would. Taylor guided his plane over the predicted path of the submarine and released the torpedo. Fido, a short, stubby cylinder, packed with explosives, dropped into the ocean. Once submerged, it began to execute its own search pattern, its sensitive hydrophones listening. It wasn't aimed at the submarine. It was simply released into the same body of water. For the crew of the I-52, the first indication of an attack may have been a strange, high-pitched pinging sound, an alien noise in the familiar symphony of the sea. It was the sound of Fido's own active sonar, searching for them. As the sound grew louder, more rapid, a terrifying realization must have dawned in the control room. Something was actively hunting them. Then, the world ended. Back in Taylor's Avenger, the radio operator, listening through the sonobuoys, would have heard it clearly. A sudden, violent crack, followed by a horrifying cascade of crushing, grinding noises. Later reports described it as the sound of a tin can being crushed. It was the sound of the I-52's pressure hull imploding, the immense weight of the ocean collapsing its steel frame in an instant. The rhythmic thumping of the propellers ceased. Then, an unnerving silence. To be certain, Taylor circled and dropped a second Fido into the wounded sea. A few minutes later, another explosion echoed through the hydrophones, followed by more sounds of a vessel breaking apart. The hunt was over. The grid of colored dye, floating on the surface, was now a tombstone for 95 men, 2 tons of gold, and the technological hopes of an empire. The entire engagement, from the first radar contact to the final, crushing silence, had taken less than 3 hours. But the consequences of that silence were about to send a shockwave of terror through the entire Japanese submarine fleet. The hunt may have ended, but the psychological haunting was just beginning. The destruction of the I-52 was not an isolated event recorded in the dry ledgers of war. It was a ghost story, whispered from one submarine crew to another across the vast emptiness of the Pacific. A pattern had begun to emerge, as terrifying as it was inexplicable. Veteran crews in state-of-the-art submarines would depart for their patrol zones and then simply vanish. There were no distress signals, no oil slicks, no wreckage for grieving families to mourn. There was only a profound and chilling silence. One by one, the pride of the Japanese submarine fleet was being plucked from the ocean by an unseen, unheard predator. A deep, gnawing paranoia began to set in. The ocean, their home, and their shield had turned against them. For the Japanese submariner, the deep was a sacred space. It was a place of tactical advantage, of stealth, and of psychological security. But now, it was becoming a place of terror. The feeling was one of being constantly watched, of being hunted by a foe that operated outside the known rules of naval warfare. Every creak of the hull, every command whispered in the control room, felt like it was being overheard by a hostile presence. The psychological toll was immense. How do you fight an enemy you can neither see nor understand? How do you maintain your courage when your sanctuary has become a transparent cage and you are the specimen being observed? The crushing weight of this technological asymmetry began to break the spirit of even the most hardened sailors. If the sinking of the I-52 was the first note of this terrifying new song, then Operation Barney was its horrifying crescendo. In mid-1945, the United States Navy decided to prove, in the most dramatic way possible, that there was no place left for the Japanese to hide. The target was the Sea of Japan, a body of water the Japanese considered their own imperial lake. It was their backyard, a strategic sanctuary heavily protected by some of the most formidable minefields in the world, particularly in the narrow Tsushima Strait. To the Japanese High Command, it was unthinkable that an enemy submarine could penetrate these defenses. It was their last safe waterway, the vital artery for shipping raw materials to the homeland. To breach this fortress, the Americans deployed another revolutionary technology, advanced FM sonar. Previous sonar systems were good at detecting large objects like ships, but they were crude. This new, high-frequency sonar was different. It could paint a detailed acoustic picture of the water ahead of the submarine, allowing operators to distinguish the small, spherical shape of an individual mine from the surrounding clutter of rocks and seafloor. For the first time, American submarines could see in the dark, navigating through dense minefields as if they had a detailed map. 9 U.S. submarines, a special task force nicknamed the Hellcats, were assigned this audacious mission. One by one, they slipped into the Tsushima Strait, their hulls gliding silently just feet away from mines that would have vaporized them. For the Japanese sailors guarding these waters, the sound of this new sonar was a terrifying omen. Its high-frequency ping was unlike anything they had ever heard before. It was sharp, clear, and relentlessly methodical. It became known among them by a chilling nickname, Hell's Bells. Hearing it meant you were not just being searched for, you were being seen. It was the sound of your sanctuary being violated, the sound of ghosts walking through walls. Once inside the supposedly safe Sea of Japan, the 9 Hellcats unleashed a devastating rampage. For weeks, they moved with impunity, sinking 28 Japanese ships, including one of their last remaining submarines, the I-122. The psychological impact was catastrophic, far outweighing the material damage. It was a brutal and undeniable demonstration of American technological dominance. If American submarines could slip through their most heavily defended waters and operate freely, then nowhere was safe. The war was no longer on some distant frontier. It was knocking at their very doorstep. The illusion of security was shattered forever. This systemic destruction, both physical and psychological, culminated in the quiet despair of Japan's best and brightest. Men like Captain Tatsunosuke Arizumi, a brilliant tactician and one of the architects of the ambitious I-400 underwater aircraft carrier program, saw the writing on the wall. After Japan's surrender, facing the humiliation of defeat and the full crushing realization of the technological chasm his nation had failed to cross, Arizumi chose a traditional, tragic end. His suicide was symbolic of the death of an entire philosophy of war, the belief that Japanese spirit and martial perfection could overcome the cold, hard mathematics of industrial might. He hadn't been defeated by a single shell or torpedo. He was defeated by an equation he finally understood was unsolvable. The war of explosions and steel was over. The physical threat was gone. But for the Japanese sailors who survived, a final, more profound shock awaited them. They had been beaten by technology they couldn't comprehend. Now, they were about to come face to face with the culture and the industrial power that had created it. They were about to see the source of America's overwhelming power, not on a sonar screen or at the receiving end of a torpedo, but in the mundane, everyday details of their captors' lives. And this revelation would be more stunning, and in some ways more devastating, than any weapon unleashed upon them. For the sailors and officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy who survived the war, the surrender was more than just a military defeat. It was the collapse of their entire universe. Their training, their culture, and their national identity had been built on a foundation of spiritual strength and martial superiority. Now, they found themselves prisoners, stripped of their weapons and their pride, forced to confront the incomprehensible power that had brought their empire to its knees. No one felt this dislocation more keenly than men like Lieutenant Commander Nukio Nambu, the former commander of the giant submarine I-401. After the surrender, Nambu and his crew were taken aboard an American submarine tender. For the first time, he was not looking at the enemy through a periscope, but living among them. He expected to see a reflection of his own reality. A crew that was hardened, weary, and stretched to the breaking point by years of brutal conflict. He expected to see evidence of a nation that, like his own, had sacrificed everything for the war effort. Instead, what he witnessed was a profound and deeply unsettling form of normalcy. It was this casual, almost effortless display of power that delivered the final, crushing psychological blow. Nambu was given access to an American radio, and what he heard stunned him into a new understanding of the war. He wasn't listening to propaganda broadcasts or grim news from the front. He was listening to the everyday pulse of American life. He heard advertisements for new cars and refrigerators, items of unimaginable luxury in a Japan where civilian resources had long since vanished. He heard detailed reports on crop harvests and factory production numbers that spoke of an economy not just surviving, but thriving. He heard the scores of baseball games, a national pastime that continued uninterrupted, as if the largest war in human history were a distant, manageable inconvenience. This was the source of what he would later call America's casual efficiency. It wasn't the size of their battleships or the speed of their planes that was so overwhelming. It was the depth of the industrial and cultural well from which that power was drawn. Japan had wagered its entire existence on the war, converting every factory and mobilizing every citizen in a desperate, all-or-nothing struggle. For the United States, this titanic global conflict seemed to be just one of many national projects, managed by a system so vast and robust that it could produce guns and butter, tanks and televisions, all at the same time. The war was not an existential struggle for America. It was a logistical problem to be solved, and the American industrial machine was the most powerful problem-solving engine the world had ever known. He saw it in the small details. He saw it in the endless supply of fresh food and clean uniforms for the American sailors, a stark contrast to the meager rations and worn-out gear of his own men. He saw it in the relaxed confidence of his captors, young men who treated their complex machinery with a familiar ease, as if they had grown up surrounded by it. They were not the fanatical warriors of Japanese propaganda. They were mechanics, electricians, and engineers who had been sent to do a job, and they had been given the very best tools to do it. From this vantage point, surrounded by the mundane evidence of America's incomprehensible might, the entire Japanese war effort began to seem tragically, fatally flawed. All the courage, all the discipline, all the years of brutal training and selfless sacrifice, what was it all worth in the face of an enemy who could simply produce and innovate on a scale that defied imagination? The I-52 was not sunk by a single lucky pilot or a fortunate torpedo. It was sunk by the factories in Ohio, the research labs in Massachusetts, and the assembly lines in California. It was sunk by a system. It was here, in the quiet humiliation of captivity, that Nambu and his fellow officers came to the story's inescapable conclusion. It was a truth that stripped away all the romance and glory of war, leaving only a cold, hard equation. In his own words, Nambu would later articulate the painful lesson they had all learned. Superior technology, deployed with industrial capacity, trumped courage, skill, and determination. The spirit of the samurai had been rendered obsolete by the power of the assembly line. The warrior had been defeated by the worker. This devastating epiphany marked the true end of the war for the men of the submarine fleet. Their ships were gone, their empire was in ruins, and their core beliefs had been shattered. But one final, symbolic act of destruction remained. What would become of the magnificent I-400 class submarines, the largest and most ambitious, underwater weapons ever built. These underwater aircraft carriers, Japan's ultimate superweapon, had sailed across the Pacific without firing a single shot in anger. Their fate, at the hands of their new American masters, would serve as the final, dramatic full stop on this chapter of naval history, a spectacle of destruction that would echo the very lesson Nambu had just learned. In the aftermath of Japan's surrender, the U.S. Navy found itself in possession of a remarkable prize: the surviving giants of the Japanese submarine fleet, including the technological marvels, I-400 and I-401. These were not mere submarines. They were underwater aircraft carriers, weapons of audacious vision, each longer than a typical American destroyer. They were designed to surface off the coast of the United States, launch a squadron of bombers, and strike targets like the Panama Canal or even New York City. They were the ultimate expression of Japan's superweapon philosophy. Yet, for all their magnificent engineering, they had accomplished nothing of operational significance. They were a solution to a strategic problem Japan no longer had the resources to exploit. American naval engineers and intelligence officers were astounded by what they found. The sheer scale and complexity of the I-400 class were beyond anything they had conceived. They represented a different path of technological evolution, one that prioritized range, size, and unique capabilities over mass production. However, their new American custodians also noted the glaring weaknesses that had plagued the entire Japanese submarine force. The I-400 seconds had inferior radar, less effective sonar, and lacked the integrated fire control systems that made American submarines so deadly. They were brilliant, solitary gladiators in an arena that had come to be dominated by coordinated packs of hunters. The very existence of these underwater carriers posed a dilemma. The Cold War was already beginning its slow, icy creep across the globe. The Soviet Union, now an emerging rival, had demanded access to these captured Japanese technologies. The thought of Stalin's engineers studying the secrets of the I-400 was unacceptable to the American military. A decision was made, one that was as pragmatic as it was symbolic. These magnificent machines, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. They had to disappear. So, in the spring of 1946, in a series of naval exercises off the coast of Hawaii, the I-400 and her sister ships were escorted out to sea one last time. But they were not sailing as predators. They were sailing as targets. American submarines, using the very same types of advanced torpedoes that had doomed the I-52, took aim. One after another, the largest submarines ever built were sent to the bottom of the Pacific, their complex machinery and audacious dreams erased by American ordnance. It was a deeply ironic end. A weapon designed to project Japanese power across the ocean was ultimately destroyed to prevent that same technology from spreading. It was a final, emphatic demonstration of who now ruled the waves. The ocean was no longer Japan's highway to empire. It was an American laboratory, and its floor was becoming a museum of Japanese ambition. But the story does not end there. In the silence of the deep, the legacy of this catastrophic technological failure was not lost on the generation of Japanese leaders, engineers, and industrialists who survived the war. The lesson, learned in the most brutal way imaginable, was seared into their national consciousness. Never again would they allow themselves to be so catastrophically outmaneuvered by technology. The war had proven that industrial capacity, relentless innovation, and systemic efficiency were the true measures of a nation's strength. Courage was noble, but it was no substitute for a superior production line. This painful realization became the unspoken foundation of Japan's post-war economic miracle. The same brilliant minds and disciplined workforce that had built the world's largest battleships and submarines now turned their attention to a different kind of manufacturing. They channeled their energy and precision not into weapons of war, but into cars, cameras, and consumer electronics. The focus on quality, miniaturization, and relentless improvement hallmarks of Japanese engineering was applied to a new, peaceful battlefield. The global marketplace. Companies that would become household names around the world rose from the ashes of the empire, guided by this new philosophy. Sony, founded in 1946, would revolutionize electronics with the transistor radio. Honda, which began by putting surplus generator motors on bicycles, would become a giant in automotive engineering. Toyota, refining its production system into a model of legendary efficiency, would conquer the global car market. Each of these companies, in its own way, was a response to the trauma of 1945. They were determined to win the peace with the same intensity with which they had lost the war. They would not compete with force of arms, but with superior engineering, reliability, and a deep understanding of integrated systems, the very things their military had lacked. The story of the I-52, then, is more than a tale of naval warfare. It is a profound parable about technology, ambition, and the harsh lessons of history. The destruction of that single submarine in the Atlantic was a microcosm of a much larger industrial and technological defeat. But from the depths of that failure, a new vision was born. The ghosts of the men who went down with the I-52, I-400, and dozens of other vessels did not die in vain. Their sacrifice, born of a flawed strategy, inadvertently laid the groundwork for a new Japan, a nation that would rise to become an economic superpower, built not on military conquest, but on the very principles of industrial and technological excellence that had once defeated it. The war had ended, but the technologies it spawned were just beginning their long journey, a journey that would reshape our modern world in ways the men of 1944 could never have imagined. The story of the I-52 and the silent war beneath the waves is more than a history lesson. It's a chilling case study in the nature of disruptive innovation. The sailors aboard that submarine weren't defeated by a lack of courage or skill. They were defeated because the very reality of their battlefield had been changed without their knowledge. They were playing a game of chess, while their opponent had begun playing a three-dimensional version with pieces they couldn't even see. They were made obsolete in real time, victims of a technological blind spot so profound it cost them their lives. Their tragedy serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous threats are often the ones you cannot or will not see coming. Today, the technologies that hunted them have evolved and woven themselves into the fabric of our modern existence. The concept of a vast, invisible surveillance grid is no longer confined to the deep ocean. We live within it every day. The principles behind sonar and radar echo in the GPS that guides our cars, the Wi-Fi signals that connect our homes, and the vast network of satellites that watch over our planet. The acoustic homing torpedo, FIDO, was a primitive form of an autonomous weapon, a machine given the ability to hunt and make decisions on its own. It was a direct ancestor of the artificial intelligence and machine learning systems that are now revolutionizing every industry, from finance to medicine to warfare. The Hell's bells of FM sonar have been replaced by the silent hum of data centers and the invisible flow of information across fiber optic cables. The battlefield has changed, but the race has not. The crew of the I-52 was defeated by an invisible force they couldn't have imagined. This raises a critical and unsettling question for our own time. What are the sonar boys of the 21st century? What are the game-changing, paradigm-shifting forces that are operating just beneath the surface of our awareness, quietly making the old rules obsolete? Are they found in the rapid evolution of artificial intelligence, which promises to redefine human intelligence itself? Is it in the realm of cybersecurity, where invisible battles are fought every second for control of our data and infrastructure? Or perhaps it lies in biotechnology, with the power to rewrite the very code of life? The lesson of 1944 is that failing to recognize a fundamental shift in technology isn't just a strategic error. It can be a catastrophic one. Nations, industries, and entire ways of life can vanish. Not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a new machine executing its code. We now stand at a similar crossroads, surrounded by innovations whose ultimate consequences are still unknown. The future will be defined not by those who cling to the old maps, but by those who can perceive the new, invisible forces reshaping the landscape. And so, we want to turn the question over to you. The story of the I-52 proves that what you don't know can hurt you. In your opinion, what is the most significant invisible force or technological shift that is shaping our future right now, yet isn't getting the attention it deserves? Share your thoughts and ideas in the comments section below. We read every comment and believe the most important conversations happen when we bring history's lessons into the present. The race for technological supremacy never truly ends. The arenas just change. The ocean may no longer be the primary battlefield, but the deep, uncharted waters of innovation are vaster and more mysterious than ever before. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the silent war. And remember to subscribe for more stories that uncover the hidden forces that shape our world.